The fluorescent lights of St. Catherine's emergency room buzzed overhead as Lucia Ramirez pressed her gloved hands against the gunshot wound, feeling warm blood pulse between her fingers. The young man on the gurney couldn't have been more than 22, his dark eyes rolling back as his blood pressure dropped. She called for more O-negative, her voice steady and commanding despite the chaos around her. This was her element, controlled chaos, life and death balanced on the edge of her competence. As she worked, her trained eyes caught the tattoo on his inner forearm, a serpent coiled around a dagger, Salvatore family marking. She'd seen that same ink on 3 other gunshot victims this month alone. The war between the crime families was escalating, spilling more blood into her ER with every passing week. Each body told a story of territory disputes, revenge killings, and a violence that never seemed to end. She saved him, stabilized his vitals, closed the wound, and sent him to recovery where he'd be guarded by men in expensive suits until he could walk out and probably get shot again within the month. It was a cycle she'd witnessed for 3 years now, ever since she'd returned to the city, ever since her father had disappeared. The shift ended at midnight, but Lucia didn't go straight home. She never did anymore. Instead, she stopped at a 24-hour diner, ordered black coffee she wouldn't drink, and opened her laptop in the corner booth, where she could see both exits. Old habits. Paranoia kept you alive when you were doing what she was doing. By 2 in the morning, she was back in her cramped studio apartment in a neighborhood that real estate agents called up and coming, but was really just gentrifying poverty. The space was small but hers. A Murphy bed she never folded up, a kitchenette with a coffee maker that got more use than the stove, and a desk covered in files, printouts, and 3 different laptops at various stages of encryption. Lucia pulled her dark hair from its practical bun and let it fall around her shoulders as she settled into her desk chair. This was her real work. The nursing paid the bills and gave her access to the casualties of gang violence. But this shadow journalism, this was her purpose. 3 years ago, her father had vanished. Antonio Ramirez, a hospital administrator with a gambling problem and debts he couldn't pay. That's what the police had told her. That he'd gotten involved with the Salvatore family, borrowed money he couldn't return, and probably ended up in the river or a shallow grave somewhere outside the city. Case closed. Life moved on. But Lucia hadn't moved on. She'd become obsessed. She'd taught herself forensic accounting, learned how to navigate the dark web, built relationships with hackers and whistleblowers and people who lived in the shadows of the criminal underworld. And slowly, painfully, she'd started piecing together the empire of corruption that had swallowed her father whole. Tonight she was following a money trail that made her hands shake with anticipation. Months of work had led her to this. Shell companies layered like Russian nesting dolls, all funneling money from gambling operations, protection rackets, and drug distribution into legitimate businesses. Medical supply companies, construction firms, real estate holdings. The Salvatore family wasn't just running a criminal empire. They were building a legitimate one on top of it, washing blood money until it came out clean. But here's what made tonight different. Here's what made her heart race as her fingers flew across the keyboard. The accounts she was looking at weren't just Salvatore operations. There were Ferraro holdings mixed in. Joint ventures, shared investments. The 2 families that had been at war for decades were actually partnered in business, even as they killed each other in the streets. It was massive, explosive, the kind of story that could bring down politicians, freeze assets, trigger federal investigations. Lucia's anonymous blog had already caused serious damage with her previous exposés. Bank accounts had been frozen, low-level operators had been arrested. But this was the whole operation laid bare. She hit publish at 3:47 in the morning. The article went live under her pseudonym, as always, The Witness. No byline, no credit. Just truth thrown into the world like a grenade with the pin pulled. Lucia sat back, exhausted and exhilarated. She allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before the familiar guilt crept in. Her father was still gone. These articles didn't bring him back. They didn't heal the wound of losing him or fill the hole his absence had left in her life. But at least she was fighting. At least she was making them pay. She glanced at the window and froze. There was a black SUV parked across the street. Tinted windows, engine running. It hadn't been there an hour ago. Her mouth went dry. She'd been careful, so careful. Multiple VPNs, encrypted everything, never using her real name or location. But maybe careful wasn't enough anymore. Lucia stood slowly, moving away from the window. She was being paranoid. She'd been paranoid before. The SUV was probably nothing. Someone visiting a neighbor. A rideshare driver waiting for a pickup. Normal, innocent explanations existed. She turned back to her laptop, telling herself to calm down, when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Footsteps in the hallway outside her door, multiple sets, moving with purpose and trying to be quiet about it. Her heart slammed into her throat. She moved fast, grabbing her phone, looking for a weapon, any weapon. Her hand closed around the heavy brass lamp on her desk just as the door exploded inward. The force of the breach sent the door crashing against the wall. Armed men poured into her apartment like a tactical team, dressed in black, faces covered, moving with military precision. Lucia didn't freeze. She swung the lamp with all the strength in her body, connected with the first man's head, heard the satisfying crunch of impact. He went down. She ran for the window, but a gloved hand grabbed her hair and yanked her back. She screamed, fought, drove her elbow into someone's gut, heard a grunt of pain. Another set of hands grabbed her arms. She kicked backward, connected with a knee, twisted and bit down hard on a hand that tried to cover her mouth. Tasted blood, heard cursing, but there were too many of them. Professional, trained. They weren't trying to kill her, just subdue her, and that somehow made it worse. A hand clamped over her mouth from behind. Chemical-soaked cloth pressed against her nose and face. She held her breath, thrashed wildly, but her lungs were already burning. She had to breathe. Had to. The last thing Lucia saw before the darkness took her was her father's photograph on her desk. Antonio Ramirez, smiling in a moment frozen in time before everything fell apart. Then nothing. Just black emptiness swallowing her whole. When consciousness started to creep back, it came in fragments. Softness beneath her. The smell of expensive fabric softener. Distant sounds of traffic but muffled, far away. Her head pounded and her mouth tasted like chemicals and copper. She kept her eyes closed, tried to assess before revealing she was awake. Her wrists ached but weren't bound. She was lying on something soft. A bed. Lucia's eyes snapped open and immediately regretted it. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, painfully bright. She was in a bedroom that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. Enormous four-poster bed with silk sheets in deep burgundy. Furniture that was probably worth more than everything she owned. Artwork on the walls that might have been original. And those windows, offering a view of a city skyline she didn't immediately recognize, though it looked like downtown but from a higher vantage point than she'd ever seen. She sat up slowly, her nurse training kicking in as she assessed herself for injuries. Bruises on her wrists from where they'd grabbed her, a tender spot on her scalp where someone had pulled her hair, otherwise intact. Still wearing the same clothes she'd had on last night, jeans and a t-shirt, though her shoes were gone. Lucia swung her legs off the bed and immediately noticed the guards. 2 men in dark suits stationed outside the door, visible through the crack. The door itself was heavy wood, probably solid. She tried it anyway, locked from the outside, the windows next. She moved to them quickly, looked down, and felt her stomach drop. She was at least 15 floors up, maybe more. The windows were sealed, no way to open them. And there, in the manicured gardens far below, she could see more guards patrolling. This wasn't just a house. This was a fortress. She spent the next hour searching every inch of the room, looking for weapons, weak points, anything useful. The bathroom was stocked with expensive toiletries, towels softer than anything she'd ever owned, but nothing sharp or heavy enough to use as a weapon. The closet held clothes that weren't hers, designer labels in her exact size, which was somehow more disturbing than the finding it empty. Around noon, a woman knocked and entered without waiting for permission. Middle-aged, professionally dressed, carrying a tray of food that smelled incredible despite Lucia's fear. The woman set it on the desk, wouldn't make eye contact, and left quickly. The door locked behind her with a definitive click. Lucia didn't touch the food, couldn't. Her stomach was twisted into knots. She was being held prisoner by people professional enough to have tailored clothes waiting for her. People who knew her size, people who'd been planning this. The hours crawled by. She tried the door again, checked the windows again, paced like a caged animal because that's exactly what she was. And through it all, one thought kept circling her mind. They'd taken her because of the article, because she'd gotten too close to something important, because someone powerful wanted her silenced. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances, when the door finally opened without a knock, and Vincenzo Ferraro walked into her prison. Would you risk everything for the truth about a loved one's disappearance, even if it meant becoming a target yourself? Lucia had seen photographs, grainy surveillance shots she'd collected during her research. Images that didn't do him justice, she realized now, as Vincenzo Ferraro stood in the doorway of her gilded cage. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from discipline rather than vanity. Broad shoulders filled out a charcoal suit tailored to absolute perfection. Dark hair swept back from a face that could have been carved from marble, strong jaw, high cheekbones, and eyes that stopped her breath, silver gray like storm clouds or gunmetal, observing her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and invisible. There was a scar along his jawline, thin and white, old enough to have faded but still visible. A reminder that underneath the expensive suit was a man who'd survived violence, who'd probably dealt it out in equal measure. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The click of the lock felt final. They were alone now, predator and prey, and Lucia felt every instinct in her body screaming at her to run even though there was nowhere to go. She stood her ground, lifted her chin, refused to show the fear coursing through her veins like ice water. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and measured, calm in a way that suggested he was always calm, always in control. The kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to command obedience. He told her good evening as if this were a social call. Asked if she'd eaten, she wanted to spit at him. Instead, she demanded to know where she was, who he was, though she already knew, what he wanted with her. Vincenzo moved further into the room with the easy confidence of a man in his own territory. He was exactly that. This was his fortress, his empire. She was just a piece on a board she didn't fully understand yet. He told her directly, no games, no pretense. He was Vincenzo Ferraro, head of the Ferraro crime family. She was Lucia Ramirez, the anonymous journalist who'd been causing considerable problems for his organization and others. Her latest article, published just hours before her abduction, had been the final straw. Lucia's hands clenched into fists. She told him she'd expose the truth. That he and the Salvatoris were criminals, that everything she'd written was factual, that kidnapping her wouldn't change what was already out there. Her voice was steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs. His expression didn't change. He acknowledged that yes, the article was accurate. Yes, she'd done damage. Bank accounts were already being investigated. Law enforcement was asking uncomfortable questions. But here was what she didn't understand. She hadn't just exposed criminal operations. She'd exposed a truce. The Ferraro and Salvatore families had been at war for 3 years. Open war. Bodies dropping in the streets. Shipments hijacked. Soldiers killed in broad daylight. The violence was bleeding both families dry, attracting federal attention neither could afford. So the old guard, the consigliere, and underbosses who remembered when the families had cooperated, had brokered a peace, shared investments, joint territories, an uneasy alliance. And Lucia's article had revealed it to the world and to hardliners in both families, who saw cooperation as weakness. Within hours of publication, there'd been 3 separate shooting incidents. The peace was fracturing, the war was reigniting. She listened, her mind racing. She wanted to feel triumph, wanted to be glad that she'd disrupted their criminal enterprise, but something in his tone made her uneasy. This wasn't leading where she'd expected. Vincenzo told her that both families agreed something had to be done. The violence had to stop before it destroyed them all. They needed a new truce, something stronger than shared business interests, something binding, traditional. His gray eyes held hers as he delivered the blow. A marriage alliance between the Ferraro and Salvatore families. And she was the bride they'd chosen. Lucia laughed. It burst out of her, sharp and bitter, because it was absurd, insane. She told him she wasn't Salvatore. She was nobody, a nurse and a blogger with no family connections, no value as a bargaining chip. That's where she was wrong, he informed her. Her father, Antonio Ramirez, had owed significant debts to the Salvatore family, money borrowed and never repaid, services rendered that put him in their debt. When he disappeared 3 years ago, that debt had passed to his next of kin, to her. The Salvatores had agreed to forgive the debt, to accept her as payment of what was owed, and to offer her as the bride in this alliance. The Ferraros had agreed to accept. And just like that, her life had been bargained away by men in expensive suits, making deals over cigars and whiskey. Lucia felt the room tilt. Her father's debts. They'd sold her to settle his accounts. Rage exploded in her chest, white hot and consuming. She moved without thinking, crossing the space between them, her hand raised to strike him, to hurt him, to do something, anything. He caught her wrist effortlessly. His hand was large enough to encircle her wrist completely, warm and strong. He caught the other wrist when she tried with her left hand, held both of them gently but firmly, stopping her attack without hurting her. They were close now, close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive and subtle, mixed with something else, gunpowder, the scent of violence hidden under civilization. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the coiled strength in his grip. He wasn't even trying, and she couldn't break free. His voice dropped lower. He told her she could hate him, that was her right. But she would wear his ring. She would stand beside him at the altar. She would play the role of devoted wife in public. Because if she didn't, both families would hunt down everyone she'd ever cared about. Her colleagues at the hospital, her few friends, the sources who'd helped her with her articles. Everyone would pay for her refusal. The threat was delivered calmly, matter-of-factly, which somehow made it worse. This wasn't anger or cruelty. This was business. This was how his world worked. He released her wrists and stepped back. The absence of his touch felt like cold air on her skin. He moved to the door, told her that the wedding would take place in 1 week. She had that long to accept her new reality. Clothes and anything else she needed would be provided. Guards would remain outside her door, for her protection, he claimed, though they both knew what he meant. Lucia wanted to argue, to fight, to scream that this was insane and illegal and couldn't possibly be happening. But the words stuck in her throat because she could see the truth in his eyes. This was happening. Her consent was irrelevant. She was already trapped. He paused at the door, turned back, told her that for what it was worth, he took no pleasure in forcing this. But peace required sacrifice. And she was the sacrifice both families had agreed upon. Then he left, and the lock clicked behind him, and Lucia was alone in her beautiful prison. She stood frozen for a long moment. Then her knees gave out and she sank to the floor, back against the bed, and let the tears come. Hot, angry tears that she'd been holding back since she woke up in this nightmare. She'd survived losing her father. She'd rebuilt her life from nothing. She'd thought she was strong enough to face anything. But this? Being sold like property? Being forced to marry a man who represented everything she'd been fighting against? This was a kind of violation that made her feel hollow and desperate. She cried until she had no tears left. Then she sat on the floor of her cage and did what she'd always done when the world became too much. She started planning, looking for exits, weaknesses, opportunities. She'd survived before. She'd survive this too. And somehow, someday, she'd find a way out. Even if it meant playing along until she saw her chance. Vincenzo Ferraro thought he'd won. He'd trapped her, forced her into this sick arrangement. But Lucia had spent 3 years learning how powerful men operated, how they thought, what they overlooked. She'd find his weakness. She'd find her way out. She just had to survive long enough to see the opening. In the darkness of the bedroom, with the city lights glowing beyond the windows, Lucia Ramirez made herself a promise. She would not break. She would not give up. And one day somehow, she would make them all pay for what they'd done to her. But first, she had to survive a wedding to the devil himself. The next 3 days passed in a surreal blur of preparations that felt more like being dressed for sacrifice than being prepared for a wedding. Women came and went from Lucia's room. Stylists and seamstresses and makeup artists, all treating her with professional courtesy while carefully avoiding eye contact. As if looking at her directly might force them to acknowledge what was really happening here. They measured her for the dress, took her to a room filled with designer gowns, and told her to choose, though the word choice felt obscene when she had no choice in anything that mattered. She'd picked one at random, too numb to care. Custom Valentino, they'd told her, with reverence. Ivory silk with intricate lace detailing. Fitted bodice and flowing train. The kind of dress little girls dreamed about. Lucia had dreamed about her wedding once, back when she was young and stupid enough to believe in fairy tales. This wasn't that dream. This was a nightmare wearing wedding clothes. They taught her things. How to stand beside him without looking terrified. How to smile for photographs. Which fork to use at formal dinners. How to be a mafia wife, basically. Though they never used those words. They called it etiquette. Deportment. As if applying fancy language would change what this was. On the 4th day, Lucia met Vincenzo's grandmother. Nonna Ferraro arrived in the afternoon. A small woman with silver hair pinned in an elegant bun and sharp dark eyes that missed nothing. She looked like someone's sweet grandmother in her simple black dress and pearl necklace. Until you saw those eyes. There was steel in them. Survival. This woman had lived through things that would break most people. She dismissed the stylist with a wave of her hand and sat across from Lucia in the sitting area of her prison room. Poured tea from a service that had been brought up. Offered Lucia a cup like they were having a normal visit. Lucia wanted to refuse but found herself accepting the tea. Something about Nonna Ferraro demanded basic courtesy, even in the middle of a kidnapping. The old woman studied her for a long moment. Then she spoke in accented English, her voice surprisingly gentle. She told Lucia that she knew this wasn't what she wanted, that being forced into this marriage was a terrible thing, that she was sorry it had to be this way. But then her tone shifted, became harder. She told Lucia about violence, about what happened when the families went to war, about children caught in crossfire, about wives widowed, about mothers burying sons. The old woman had lived through multiple wars between the families. She'd buried her husband and 2 of her 3 sons. She'd sewn Vincenzo's wounds with her own hands when he was just a boy of 14 and came home covered in his parents' blood. She told Lucia that this marriage, as wrong as it was, would save lives, would prevent other women from losing everyone they loved, would stop the cycle of violence, at least for a while. Then Nonna Ferraro leaned forward and said something that made Lucia's breath catch. She told her to look at Vincenzo carefully. Really look. Because her grandson had forgotten how to feel anything but duty and rage. The boy who'd cried for his dead mother had become a man who couldn't cry at all. The war had taken his humanity piece by piece. And if Lucia had any kindness in her heart, She wouldn't let this world do the same to her. The old woman left, and Lucia sat alone with her tea and thoughts that wouldn't stop churning. She didn't want to feel sympathy for Vincenzo Ferraro, didn't want to see him as anything but the monster who'd stolen her freedom. But Nona's words had planted something she couldn't quite uproot. A question. Who was he before the violence made him into this? The day of the wedding arrived with terrible inevitability. They dressed her like a doll. The Valentino gown fit perfectly, of course. Everything in this nightmare world fit perfectly. Hair arranged in soft curls that fell over one shoulder. Makeup applied by expert hands until she looked like a stranger in the mirror. Beautiful, terrified. A bride being led to slaughter. No one asked if she was ready. No one asked if this was what she wanted. They simply led her downstairs when it was time, through halls of marble and artwork that probably cost millions, to a private cathedral that existed within the estate grounds. The cathedral was full. Rows of men in expensive suits and women dripping in diamonds. Dangerous people playing at civility. Lucia could feel their eyes on her as she walked down the aisle alone. No father to give her away because her father was dead and gone, and probably forgotten by everyone except her. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. She was alone, property being transferred. No family to protect her or speak for her. Vincenzo waited at the altar, and Lucia's traitorous heart skipped when she saw him. He wore a black tuxedo tailored so perfectly it might have been painted on his body. His dark hair was swept back, the scar on his jaw visible, and those gray eyes locked onto her with an intensity that made everything else fade into background noise. He was devastatingly handsome. She hated that she noticed, hated that some stupid part of her brain registered his beauty even while the rest of her wanted to run screaming from the cathedral. The priest spoke in Italian, words she didn't understand binding her to a man she barely knew. She repeated the phrases they'd taught her phonetically, her voice surprisingly steady. Vincenzo's responses were firm, certain, as if he'd done this 100 times before. When the priest instructed them to exchange rings, Vincenzo produced a band that made Lucia's breath catch. Platinum set with a single flawless diamond. Elegant and understated. Expensive but not ostentatious. He slipped it onto her finger with steady hands. It fit perfectly, of course. Her hand trembled as she placed his ring, a simple platinum band, on his finger. His hands were larger than she'd expected. Scarred knuckles. Hands that had killed. That would now wear a symbol of their forced union. Then the priest said something in Italian and Vincenzo stepped closer. She realized with sudden panic what was coming next. The kiss, the seal of their vows. He lifted her veil slowly, giving her time to see it coming. His hand cupped her jaw, thumb brushing her cheekbone. And then he kissed her. It wasn't brutal or demanding. It was controlled, possessive but not cruel. His lips were warm and firm against hers, tasting of whiskey and something darker. The kiss lasted only seconds, but it burned itself into her memory. The first kiss with her husband, her captor, the man who now owned her, at least in the eyes of everyone watching. When he pulled back, his gray eyes searched hers for something. She didn't know what he saw, but something passed between them in that moment, a recognition. They were both trapped now, both prisoners of this arrangement, even if his cage was gilded and his came with power. The reception was held in a ballroom that belonged in a palace. Crystal chandeliers, orchestra playing, tables laden with food that probably cost more than Lucia made in a month. She sat beside Vincenzo at the head table, his hand occasionally resting on hers, in a show of unity that made her skin crawl. People came to offer congratulations that felt like threats. Ferraro family members kissing her cheeks and welcoming her with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. She was an outsider, a nobody elevated to their world through circumstance and necessity. But it was the Salvatore delegation that made her blood run cold. Marco Salvatore approached their table with a smile that reminded her of a shark. He was in his 50s, graying at the temples, with a face that might have been handsome before cruelty carved lines into it. His suit was expensive, but he wore it wrong, like violence wrapped in silk. He made a toast, glass raised, voice carrying across the ballroom. "Welcome," he said, to the bride who thought she could expose them all. Welcome to the family she'd tried to destroy. Welcome to a life of looking over her shoulder because debts were paid but never forgiven. The room went silent, dangerous silent. Hands moved subtly toward concealed weapons. The piece was fragile as spun glass, and Marco had just thrown a rock at it. Lucia felt Vincenzo go absolutely still beside her. Then he stood slowly, deliberately. His hand settled on her shoulder, warm and heavy. A claim, a warning. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. He thanked Marco for his toast, reminded everyone present that Lucia was a Ferraro now, that she was under his protection, and that anyone who touched her, threatened her, or looked at her wrong would answer to him personally. The message was clear. She might be property, but she was his property now. And Vincenzo Ferraro protected what was his. Marco's smile faltered. Other Salvatore family members shifted uncomfortably. The moment stretched, taut as a wire about to snap. Then Marco laughed, loud and false, and raised his glass again in grudging acknowledgement. The tension broke but didn't disappear. It lingered like smoke in the air. The rest of the reception passed in a blur. Dancing she didn't remember. Food she didn't taste. Endless photographs where she was positioned and posed like a mannequin. Through it all, Vincenzo stayed close, his presence a constant pressure at her side. Protecting her or guarding her, she couldn't tell the difference anymore. Finally, mercifully, it ended. They were led to a car, showered with rose petals and well-wishes that felt hollow. The door closed, and suddenly they were alone together, man and wife, heading back to the estate that would now be her permanent prison. The silence in the car was suffocating. Lucia stared out the window, watching the city lights blur past, and felt the full weight of what had just happened settle over her like a burial shroud. She was married, legally bound to a man who'd kidnapped her, trapped in a world of violence and luxury with no way out. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her lap, tried to still them, but couldn't. The adrenaline that had carried her through the day was draining away, leaving her hollow and terrified and so tired. She felt Vincenzo's eyes on her but didn't turn to meet his gaze. Couldn't. If she looked at him she might shatter completely. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet. He told her she'd done well, that the Salvatores had expected her to break down, to make a scene, that she'd surprise them by standing strong. Lucia finally turned to look at him. The streetlights painted his face in alternating shadow and light. She told him she wasn't broken. She was furious. That there was a difference. Something flickered in his eyes, almost like approval, or maybe respect. He told her good. That broken things didn't survive in his world. That she'd need that fury to make it through what came next. Then he turned away, and they rode the rest of the way to the estate in silence. Husband and wife, captor and captive, bound together by vows spoken in a language she didn't understand, for a peace that might not last, in a world that had swallowed her whole. The wedding night loomed ahead, and Lucia had no idea what to expect from the man who now legally owned her, but wore a ring that said he was equally owned by her. Did you feel that moment when he kissed her? Is it wrong that part of you wants her to fall for the man who kidnapped her? The master suite was larger than her entire apartment had been. Lucia stood in the middle of it, still wearing the wedding dress that felt heavier with every passing moment, and took in her new reality: king-sized bed with black silk sheets, sitting area with a couch that probably cost more than a car, walk-in closet that had been filled with clothes in her size, still wearing their designer tags, bathroom in marble and gold, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A cage, however beautiful, was still a cage. Vincenzo entered behind her, closing the door with a soft click that made her tense. They were alone now. Truly alone. Man and wife on their wedding night, with expectations that made her stomach twist with anxiety. But he surprised her. He shrugged off his tuxedo jacket, draped it over a chair, and told her she could take the bed. He'd sleep on the couch. Lucia turned to stare at him. She'd been preparing herself for the worst, for him to exercise what he probably saw as his rights. Instead, he was offering her the bed and taking the significantly smaller couch that his frame wouldn't fit comfortably. Pride, stupid, stubborn pride, made her refuse. She told him she'd take the couch. This was his room, his bed, his house. She wouldn't take anything from him that wasn't already stolen. His jaw tightened. He told her not to be ridiculous, that she'd just been through an ordeal and needed proper rest. She told him she'd been through worse, that a couch was luxury compared to some of the places she'd slept during her residency. They stood there, locked in a battle of wills over who would be more uncomfortable, until Vincenzo finally sighed and said they were both being idiots. The bed was large enough for two people who weren't touching. They'd share it like adults. Unless she was uncomfortable with that, in which case he'd sleep on the floor before letting her take the couch. She wanted to argue, wanted to maintain her anger and her distance. But exhaustion was pulling at her bones and the dress was cutting into her ribs, and she just didn't have the energy for this battle. Fine, she agreed. They'd share the bed, but he stayed on his side, and she stayed on hers. That first night, Lucia changed into pajamas in the bathroom with the door locked, emerged to find him already in bed on the far side with his back to her, giving her privacy. She slipped under the covers on her side, maintaining at least 2 feet of empty space between them. The bed was wide enough that they might as well have been in different zip codes. She lay there rigid, hyper-aware of his presence, his breathing, the warmth radiating from his body, the knowledge that a man she barely knew was sharing her bed by force and circumstance. Sleep, when it finally came, was restless and full of dreams she couldn't remember but woke from feeling unsettled. The days that followed developed a strange rhythm. Vincenzo would wake early, usually before dawn. She'd hear him moving quietly through the room, getting dressed, trying not to disturb her. Sometimes she pretended to still be asleep. Sometimes she watched him through barely open eyes as he put on his armor of expensive suits and became the boss everyone feared. He'd leave. She'd have the suite to herself. Maids would bring breakfast. She was given freedom to roam the estate, though guards were always visible, always watching. The message was clear. She could move within her cage, but the cage had walls. She explored systematically, found the library on the second day, and nearly wept with relief. Books, thousands of them. Floor-to-ceiling shelves in a room that smelled like leather and old paper, her sanctuary in this prison. The collection surprised her. She'd expected crime novels or business books. Instead, she found philosophy, classical literature, poetry, first editions of Dante and Machiavelli, complete works of Shakespeare, modern fiction mixed with ancient texts. Someone who lived here actually read, actually thought. It didn't fit the image of the monster she needed him to be. She was sitting in one of the leather chairs, absorbed in the Count of Monte Cristo, when Vincenzo found her on the third afternoon. She hadn't heard him enter, too lost in the story of revenge and justice and the fine line between the two. His voice startled her. He asked if she was enjoying the book. She looked up to find him leaning against the doorframe, tie loosened, looking somehow more human than the polished boss who left each morning. She admitted she was. That she'd read it before, but it felt different now, more relevant. He moved into the room, selected a bottle of whiskey from a sidebar she hadn't noticed, poured 2 glasses, offered her one. She surprised herself by accepting. They talked about the book, about justice and revenge and whether they were the same thing. She argued they weren't. That justice was about balance, about making things right. Revenge was about pain, about making someone else hurt the way you hurt. He disagreed, said justice was just revenge with better PR, that the law was simply organized revenge carried out by people in suits instead of shadows. The debate grew heated. She called him cynical, he called her naive. They argued across the library like scholars, not captor and captive. And somewhere in the midst of it, Lucia forgot to be afraid. Forgot to hate him with the pure intensity she'd been maintaining. He was intelligent, sharp. He actually listened to her arguments instead of dismissing them. Then he told her something that cracked the image she'd built of him. He told her about the night his family was murdered. He'd been 14. His father had enemies, everyone knew that. But they'd had an understanding, rules about civilians, about families being off limits. The Salvatore family at the time had been led by Marco's older brother, a man who'd believed in the old ways. When he died and Marco took over, those rules disappeared. They'd come at night. Vincenzo had been in his room studying of all things. He'd wanted to be a doctor, had been reading Gray's Anatomy and learning about the human body. When he heard the first gunshots, he'd hidden in his closet like a coward, he said. Listened to his father fighting, his mother screaming, his younger sister's cries cutting off too suddenly. He'd stayed hidden until silence fell, then crept out to find his world ended. His father dead in the hallway, multiple gunshot wounds. His mother in the bedroom, throat cut. His sister, 8 years old, curled in her bed with a bullet in her chest. Vincenzo's voice was flat as he told this story, as if he were reciting facts about someone else's life. But his hands gripped the whiskey glass so hard Lucia thought it might shatter. He'd called his grandfather the previous dawn, who was in Italy at the time. By morning, the compound was locked down. By that afternoon, the war had begun. Vincenzo had put away his anatomy books and picked up weapons instead. The boy who wanted to heal became a man who dealt death. Lucia sat frozen, her anger complicating into something she didn't want to feel. Sympathy, understanding. He was a monster, yes, but he'd been made into one, forged by trauma and blood and a world that gave him no other choice. She found herself asking what happened to the men who killed his family. Even though she could guess the answer, his smile was cold. He told her they'd died slowly, that some lessons needed to be thorough, that by the time he was 16, everyone knew that Vincenzo Ferraro was not to be crossed, that touching his family meant death, detailed and inevitable. The weight of that confession sat between them. He'd just admitted to torture and murder, expected her to be horrified. And she was. But she was also seeing the full picture now. The abused becoming the abuser. The victim becoming the monster. The cycle of violence that trapped everyone in its orbit. Days turned into weeks. They developed routines that felt almost domestic. Breakfast together when his schedule allowed. Her reading in the library while he worked in his office. Dinners where they talked about everything except the situation they were in. Sometimes his inner circle would visit. Dante, his second in command, was surprisingly kind to her. Mid-30s, handsome in a rough way, with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. He treated her with respect, even told her stories about young Vincenzo when prompted. The boy who wrote poetry, who'd been gentle before the world beat it out of him. She started attending some of the business meetings. Vincenzo surprised her by actually valuing her input. She'd spent years in hospitals, understood bureaucracy and paperwork and how to navigate systems. When she suggested restructuring one of their legitimate businesses to avoid red flags, he'd implemented it. She was becoming part of this world, she realized with creeping horror. Adapting, surviving by cooperation. It felt like betrayal of everything she'd been fighting for. But what was the alternative? Constant resistance that changed nothing. She was trapped either way. At least this way she maintained some agency. One evening she approached him with a request. She wanted to go back to nursing. Not at her old hospital where people might ask questions, but at a free clinic. Somewhere she could help people, be herself, remember who she was under all this. Vincenzo's immediate reaction was refusal. Too dangerous, too exposed. She'd be a target. They argued. She told him he'd married her to stop a war. Fine, she'd played that role. But she was still herself. Still a nurse. Still someone who saved lives. He couldn't take that from her without taking everything that made her who she was. He studied her for a long moment, then agreed with conditions. She'd have a security detail, she'd go to a clinic he'd vetted, she'd follow protocols, and she'd come home safe. Home, he'd said, as if this were her home and not her prison. But she agreed, grateful for this small freedom. And maybe that's when the shift began. At the clinic, with patients who needed her and wounds to stitch and lives to save, she felt like Lucia again. Not Mrs. Ferraro, not the Mafia wife, but herself. The security detail waited outside while she worked. And for those hours she could almost pretend her life was normal. She came home energized, filled with purpose, and caught herself calling it home without the bitter irony. When Vincenzo asked about her day, she told him about the patients, the cases, the small victories, and he listened with what seemed like genuine interest. They were settling into something. Not love, she told herself firmly, but not pure hatred anymore either. Companionship, maybe. The kind of partnership people developed when forced together by circumstance. Late one night, unable to sleep, Lucia went downstairs for water. She found Vincenzo in the kitchen, shirtless, nursing a whiskey at 3 a.m. His back was to her and she froze in the doorway. Scars. So many scars. Raised white lines across his back and ribs. Bullet wounds, knife wounds. Evidence of a life lived in violence. A roadmap of survival carved into his skin. He must have sensed her presence because he turned, caught her staring, asked if she was disgusted. His tone was challenging, almost expecting her revulsion. Lucia surprised them both by saying no. That she was angry someone had hurt him. That looking at those scars made her angry, not disgusted. Something shifted in his expression. He crossed the kitchen slowly, giving her time to retreat. She didn't move, couldn't. Her pulse was racing, but not entirely from fear. He stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth from his body, smell his skin, clean and male. His hand lifted to cup her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone with unexpected gentleness. He asked, voice rough, if he kissed her right now, would she hate herself for wanting it? The question hung between them, loaded with weeks of tension and proximity and grudging respect. Lucia's breath caught. Her heart hammered. Every logical part of her brain screamed that this was wrong, that he was her captor, that she couldn't want this. But her body had stopped listening to logic. Heat was pooling low in her belly, her skin felt too tight. She was hyper-aware of how close he was, how easy it would be to close the distance. Before she could answer, before she could do something stupid and irrevocable, his phone shattered the moment. Emergency, his face went hard as he answered. Bodies found. Salvatore hit. Business pulling him back from whatever edge they'd been standing on. He grabbed his shirt, told her to go back to bed, and was gone within minutes, leaving her alone in the kitchen, trembling and confused and furious at herself for the disappointment flooding through her. She touched her face where his hand had been, still felt the ghost of his touch, and realized with sinking dread that something had changed. She wasn't just surviving captivity anymore. She was feeling things she had no right to feel for the man who'd stolen her freedom. Lucia climbed back to bed alone, lay in the space that still smelled faintly of him, and tried not to think about how much easier this would be if she could just keep hating him purely. But pure hatred required him to be a simple monster. And Vincenzo Ferraro was proving to be dangerously, devastatingly complicated. All right, be honest. Did you want him to kiss her? Are we all falling for the dangerous man who's holding her captive? The attack came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, which was perhaps the most terrifying thing about it. Violence didn't announce itself with storm clouds or ominous music. It just happened, sudden and brutal, while you were doing something mundane like having tea in the garden. Lucia had been sitting with Nonna Ferraro on the terrace, enjoying the spring sunshine and listening to the old woman tell stories about Italy and the family's history there. The kind of afternoon that felt almost normal, almost pleasant. If you could forget the armed guards patrolling the perimeter and the fact that she was still essentially a prisoner. The first shot didn't sound like a gunshot. It sounded like a firecracker or a car backfiring, something Lucia's brain tried to explain away as harmless. But Nonna Ferraro's face went white, and she was moving, faster than a woman her age should be able to move, shoving Lucia behind the stone fountain that anchored the garden. Then the world exploded into chaos. Gunfire, real, unmistakable, terrifying. The sharp crack of rifles, the deeper boom of shotguns. Return fire from the estate guards, who were suddenly not just decoration but soldiers fighting for their lives, for her life. Lucia pressed herself against the fountain, stone cold against her back, and tried to make herself smaller. Nonna Ferraro was beside her, surprisingly calm, one wrinkled hand gripping Lucia's arm. The old woman had lived through this before, multiple times. She knew how to survive. Men in dark clothes were breaching the walls. Lucia caught glimpses between the fountain and the garden structures. Armed professional, wearing colors she recognized from the wedding. Salvatore soldiers. They'd come for her. Or come to shatter the peace. Maybe both. The estate guards were outnumbered but better positioned. They knew every inch of this property, every sight line, every defensive position. But the attackers had surprise and numbers. It was brutal and efficient. And Lucia had seen enough gunshot wounds in the ER to know people were dying out there. Then she saw him. Vincenzo appeared like something out of a nightmare, or an avenging angel, depending on your perspective. He moved through the garden with lethal precision, a gun in each hand, firing with accuracy that would be beautiful if it weren't so deadly. Men fell. He didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, just moved and shot and moved again, closing the distance between himself and where Lucia huddled behind the fountain. A Salvatore soldier saw her, raised his rifle. Lucia froze, staring at her death. Then Vincenzo was there, stepping between her and the gun, firing 3 times in rapid succession. The soldier dropped. Vincenzo reached the fountain, his body covering hers, pressing her down as bullets sparked off the stone around them. She could feel his heart pounding against her back, hard and fast, smell gunpowder and his cologne and fierce sweat. His arm was steel around her waist, holding her like if he just held tight enough nothing could touch her. He fired over the fountain's edge, taking down another attacker. Shouted orders to his men in Italian. The gunfire was deafening this close. Lucia's ears rang. She couldn't breathe properly with his weight pressing her down, but she didn't want him to move. As long as he was between her and the bullets, she was alive, time distorted. The attack might have lasted minutes or hours, Lucia couldn't tell. Just chaos and noise and terror and Vincenzo's body shielding hers. Finally, mercifully, the shooting stopped. Vincenzo's men had repelled the attack or killed everyone involved. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise, broken only by groans of wounded men and the distant sound of sirens that would arrive too late to matter. Vincenzo stayed covering her for another moment, as if he didn't trust the silence. Then he was pulling her up, hands running over her body checking for injuries, asking if she was hit. His face was intense, almost desperate. She shook her head, unable to speak, unable to process what had just happened. He looked at Nonna, got confirmation she was unharmed, then made a decision. Grabbed Lucia's hand and half dragged her toward the house. He wasn't gentle. Urgency overrode care. He needed her inside, somewhere defensible, somewhere he could protect her properly. They made it to a door she hadn't known existed. Reinforced steel hidden behind decorative panels. He shoved her through into a narrow stairwell, then into a room that was clearly a panic room. Reinforced walls, monitors showing security camera feeds, weapons, supplies, a place to hide when the war came to your door. He started to leave, had to get back to his men, had to secure the perimeter. But Lucia grabbed his jacket, fisted the expensive fabric in her hands, told him not to leave her. The words came out broken and desperate, and she didn't care. Something shifted in his face. Surprise, maybe. Or tenderness. He had a family to protect. Men fighting for him, responsibilities, but he stayed. She'd asked, and he'd stayed. In the confined space of the panic room, Lucia could see him clearly. Blood splattered across his face and shirt. Not his blood, she realized with relief that shocked her. He'd come through unscathed, but he'd killed for her. Multiple men. She'd watched him do it. Had watched him become the monster everyone said he was. And she'd never been so grateful for anyone's monstrosity in her life. Outside the panic room, the sounds of fighting had stopped. Vincenzo's phone rang constantly. Updates, casualty reports. He answered them tersely, never taking his eyes off her. 8 Salvatore's dead. 2 of his own men wounded but stable. The breach had been repelled. An hour passed before he declared it safe enough to leave. Led her upstairs to their bedroom, told her to wait while he checked every room personally, then locked them in. Lucia's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Adrenaline crash hitting hard. She sank onto the edge of the bed, feeling like her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. Vincenzo stripped off his bloody shirt, tossed it aside, moved to the bathroom to wash. When he emerged, skin clean but eyes still hard, he found her exactly where he'd left her. Still shaking, still processing. He knelt in front of her, took her hands in his larger ones. His touch was warm and solid and real. He told her he was sorry, that she shouldn't have been exposed to that he'd failed to protect her properly. She almost laughed. Failed. He'd literally used his body as a shield. Had killed men who were trying to kill her. Had stayed with her when he had 100 other responsibilities. She told him that. Told him he'd saved her life. And then, before she could overthink it, before logic could override instinct, she kissed him. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was desperate and consuming and full of 3 weeks of tension and the terror of nearly dying. She kissed him like he was air and she'd been drowning, poured all her fear and gratitude and confused feelings into the press of her mouth against his. For a heartbeat he froze. Then he was kissing her back just as fiercely. His hands came up to frame her face, angling her head to deepen the kiss. He tasted like violence and whiskey and something uniquely him. They broke apart, both breathing hard. His forehead pressed against hers. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the want warring with guilt, the need warring with the knowledge that this was complicated and wrong, and neither of them should want this. She made the choice for both of them, told him not to stop, that she needed this, needed him, needed to feel alive after coming so close to death. Something broke in his control. He kissed her again, harder this time. Hands sliding into her hair, pulling her closer. The kiss turned desperate, consuming. Weeks of proximity and denial exploding into action. Clothes disappeared, shed urgently. His hands on her skin felt like fire. He touched her like she was precious and necessary, and his. Laid her back on the bed, positioned himself over her, and paused one last time, giving her a chance to change her mind, to stop this before they crossed a line they couldn't uncross. She pulled him down instead, wrapped her legs around his waist, took him inside her body with a gasp that might have been pleasure or pain or both. The sex was intense, primal, not gentle or romantic, but raw and necessary. They moved together like they were fighting, all desperation and need and release. He was everywhere, inside her, around her, consuming her. She held him like he might disappear if she loosened her grip. When they finished, sweaty and tangled and breathless, he gathered her close, held her like she was breakable, which was funny because she felt shattered already. Neither of them spoke. Words would make them confront what they'd just done, the line they'd crossed, the fact that she'd just willingly slept with her captor, and it had been incredible, and she wanted to do it again. She traced the scars on his chest, mapping his history of violence with gentle fingers. He held her, one hand stroking through her hair, touch surprisingly tender. For the first time since her kidnapping, Lucia felt safe, actually safe. Not just physically protected, but emotionally held. It was terrifying and confusing, and she didn't want to analyze it too closely. They lay there in the wreckage of their boundaries, listening to sirens in the distance and guards repositioning outside. The war had come to their door and would come again. But for this moment, in this bed, they had each other. And that was either the beginning of something beautiful or the worst mistake of Lucia's life. She honestly couldn't tell which. In the weeks that followed the attack, something fundamental shifted between them. It wasn't love, Lucia told herself firmly. But it wasn't hatred anymore either. They'd crossed into territory that had no clear name. They still shared the bed, but now they touched. His arm around her waist when they slept, her head on his chest, morning kisses that tasted like coffee and felt dangerously like affection. They had sex regularly now, sometimes desperate and intense, sometimes slow and almost tender. Neither acknowledged what it meant that she no longer resisted, that she initiated as often as he did. Vincenzo gave her more freedom. She returned to the clinic 3 days a week, went grocery shopping with guards trailing discreetly behind, had lunch with Nonna Ferraro in the city. The cage was expanding, even if the bars remained. She started attending his business meetings regularly, not just sitting silently, but participating, offering perspectives he hadn't considered. She'd spent years navigating hospital bureaucracy and insurance companies. Turned out those skills translated to navigating his business operations. She suggested restructuring one of their shipping companies to better avoid scrutiny, pointed out vulnerabilities in their money laundering operations that could be tightened, made recommendations about legitimate business expansions that would provide better cover for the illegal operations underneath. Vincenzo implemented her suggestions, valued her input, started consulting her before major decisions. She was becoming his partner, not just his forced wife. And that shift terrified her because it meant she was complicit now, actively helping the very empire she'd spent 3 years trying to expose. But what was the alternative? Passive resistance that changed nothing. She'd chosen survival, chosen adaptation. She'd tell herself later, when guilt came calling, that she'd had no choice. But deep down she knew that was a lie. She always had a choice. She was just choosing him now. Dante became an unexpected friend. He'd stop by the estate in the evenings, share drinks and stories. He told her about young Vincenzo, the boy who'd written poetry and wanted to save lives, who'd been gentle before the violence remade him. One evening, after too much wine, Dante admitted his brother had died in the ambush her father had helped orchestrate, that her father had sold information about guard positions and delivery schedules, that 12 good men had died walking into a trap Antonio Ramirez had helped set. The information sat like lead in her stomach. She wanted to defend her father, say there had to be a mistake, but she'd spent 3 years investigating these families. She knew how betrayal worked in this world, knew that informants were common and that her father had been drowning in debt and desperation. Maybe the man she'd been seeking justice for hadn't deserved it. Maybe he'd been as guilty as anyone else in this world. The thought made her grief complicated in new ways. The domesticity of her new life felt surreal. She'd wake in Vincenzo's arms, usually before dawn. He'd bring her espresso made perfectly, 2 sugars, light cream, learned through weeks of observation. They'd have breakfast on the terrace when weather allowed, talk about their plans for the day like they were a normal couple. He was funny, she discovered. Dry wit hidden under layers of authority. He made her laugh, which felt like betrayal of her former self, who'd hated him with such purity. They hosted dinner parties. Other families, business associates, politicians who took money under the table. Lucia played hostess with increasing confidence, wore designer dresses, made small talk, smiled at men she knew were criminals while discussing recipes and charity work. She was good at it. That was perhaps the most disturbing part. She was adapting to this life with ease that suggested maybe she'd always been capable of this moral flexibility. Maybe the righteous crusader had just been another role she'd played. One night, after incredible sex that left them both boneless and satisfied, Lucia lay in the dark and admitted something that scared her. Told him she'd hated him. Had been so sure she'd always hate him. But now she didn't know what she felt, but it wasn't hatred anymore. Vincenzo was quiet for a long moment, then confessed that he'd married her to end a war, that she'd been a strategic acquisition, nothing more. But somewhere between the forced vows and now, that had changed. He wanted forever with her. Actually wanted it, not just needed it for political reasons. The confession hung between them, heavy and significant. They were falling for each other, or had already fallen. The past tense was probably more accurate. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like surrender. She was losing the war with herself, losing the part of her that had been fighting this, fighting him, fighting the inexorable pull of proximity and Stockholm Syndrome, and whatever else this was. She kissed him instead of responding, let her body answer what her words couldn't. They made love again, slower this time, savoring, learning each other with patience instead of urgency. Afterward, he fell asleep holding her. She lay awake, listening to his breathing, and tried to reconcile who she was with who she was becoming. But curiosity, that old familiar demon, wouldn't leave her alone. Late one night, after Vincenzo left for a meeting out of state, Lucia found herself in his office. She'd been in here before, during the day, when he was working. But never alone. Never with the opportunity to actually look. His laptop sat on the desk, innocuous and tempting. She shouldn't. She'd promised herself she was done investigating, done digging into things better left buried. She was trying to build something here, trying to accept her new reality. But the urge was overwhelming. That same compulsion that had driven her journalism. That need to know, to understand, to uncover truth. The password screen glowed in the darkness. She tried a few combinations, failed. Then, on a whim, tried her birthday. The date she'd told him once in passing, months ago. The laptop unlocked, her heart clenched. He'd made her birthday his password. That was sweet and trusting and made what she was about to do feel even more like betrayal. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. She navigated his files methodically, looking for what she wasn't sure. Just looking. The journalist in her not quite dead, just dormant. She found financial records, shipping manifests, personnel files, all the mundane infrastructure of his empire. Nothing she didn't already know about. Nothing that surprised her. Then she found the encrypted folders, years as labels, going back 5 years, 7 years, 10. She should stop, should close the laptop and go back to bed and forget she'd ever been curious. Instead, she found the year her father disappeared. 3 years ago, opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were files, surveillance photos, transcripts, order documents, evidence meticulously catalogued. She opened them one by one, her chest growing tighter with each revelation. Photos of her father meeting with Salvatore representatives, meeting with Ferraro representatives, playing both sides. Transcripts of conversations where Antonio Ramirez sold information. Location of weapons shipments, guard schedules, names of undercover police who'd infiltrated the families. He wasn't just in debt. He was an active informant. A man playing a dangerous game for money that was never enough to satisfy his gambling addiction and his greed. Then she found the order document, dated 3 years ago, handwritten in script she recognized from the notes Vincenzo left around the house. The order was clear and cold. Eliminate the informant. Make it look like a disappearance. No body to be found. Clean removal, signed by Vincenzo Ferraro. Below that was the confirmation of completion. Antonio Ramirez terminated as ordered. Body disposed of using acid. No trace remains. The threat has been neutralized. Lucia read it 3 times, each time hoping she'd misunderstood, misread, that it said something different than what was clearly written there. But there was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. Vincenzo had ordered her father's execution, had signed off on his murder, had known all this time that he was the reason she was an orphan. She made it to his trash can before vomiting, stomach heaving, bringing up nothing because she hadn't eaten dinner. Dry heaves that shook her whole body while her mind shattered and reformed around this new reality. She'd slept with him, made love to him, let him inside her body, fallen for the man who'd murdered her father. The entire foundation of her life for the past 3 years had been seeking justice for a man this man had killed. And she'd been warming his bed, wearing his ring, playing house like it was real. The betrayal was so complete she couldn't process it, couldn't find the edges of it. It consumed everything. She sat on the floor of his office, surrounded by evidence of her father's crimes and his murder, and felt like she was drowning on dry land. Everything was a lie. Her father hadn't been the man she'd thought. Vincenzo wasn't the man she'd believed she was coming to know. Her whole reality was fiction. Hours passed. She read through all of it, every damning document, every piece of evidence. By the time sunlight started creeping through the windows, she'd seen it all, knew it all, couldn't unknow any of it. When Vincenzo returned home that morning, earlier than expected, he found her sitting in the living room. The files spread across the coffee table like an accusation. She'd arranged them carefully, made sure he'd see exactly what she'd found the moment he walked in. His face when he saw her, when he saw the documents, went through several emotions in rapid succession. Shock, guilt, resignation, pain. He knew. Had probably always known this moment would come. Had been waiting for it, maybe. She asked, voice dead and hollow, when he'd planned to tell her. Her tone made it clear she already knew the answer. Never. He'd planned to never tell her. Vincenzo sat down slowly, movements careful like he was approaching something dangerous. He told her he didn't know who she was when he gave the order, that Antonio Ramirez had used multiple names, been careful about his personal life, that he'd only connected her to the dead informant after the wedding, when it was too late. She laughed. It came out bitter and broken. Asked him if that was supposed to make it better, that he'd married his victim's daughter and just conveniently forgot to mention that detail. He tried to explain, told her what was in those documents, that her father had gotten 12 men killed, that the information he'd sold had led to ambushes, to murders, to widows and orphans, that Antonio Ramirez had been a threat that had to be eliminated. The words were practical, cold, the same logic he probably used to justify every kill. It made her want to scream. She stood, trembling with rage and grief. Told him her father had been hers, that maybe he'd been a criminal, a traitor, a terrible person, but he'd been her father, the man who'd raised her. And Vincenzo had held her, made love to her, let her fall for him while knowing what he'd done. Tears streamed down her face. She didn't wipe them away, let him see the destruction he'd caused. She told him that he'd said he married her to end a war. Fine. She'd been a pawn in that game, but falling for him? Falling in love with the man who'd murdered her father. That was the war that was destroying her from the inside out. He moved toward her. She backed away. Told him not to touch her. If he touched her, she'd shatter completely. Vincenzo stopped, hands raised in surrender. His face was more emotional than she'd ever seen it. Guilt and pain and self-loathing written clear. He said her name, just her name, like a prayer or a plea. She told him to let her go, that if he'd ever actually cared about her, if any of this had been real, he'd let her walk out that door, give her that one thing, her freedom. The silence stretched, endless, unbearable. She could see the war in his eyes, the man who never let anything go being asked to release the one thing that mattered. Finally, he stepped aside, moved away from the door, giving her the exit she'd demanded. Lucia walked past him on shaking legs, grabbed nothing, took nothing, just walked out of the estate that had been her prison and her home, into the morning sunlight, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart so broken, she didn't know if it would ever beat properly again. Behind her, Vincenzo stood in the doorway, watching her leave, not following, not stopping her, letting her go because she'd asked. Because despite everything, despite all the violence and force and control, In this one moment, he gave her choice, and that somehow made it hurt even worse. Lucia's old apartment building looked exactly the same but felt like another lifetime. She stood outside for a long moment before using the key she'd somehow still had in her pocket, wondering if the landlord had re-rented it or if it had stood empty for 3 months while she'd been gone. The door opened. The apartment was untouched. Vincenzo's people must have paid the rent, maintained it, kept it waiting for her return that they'd probably known was inevitable. The thought of his foresight made her chest ache. Inside, everything was as she'd left it the night of her abduction. Coffee mugs still sitting on the desk, brown rings staining the bottom, files still scattered. Her life interrupted mid-stride and preserved like a museum exhibit. She sat on the Murphy bed and felt nothing. Emptiness where there should be relief. She was free. She'd escaped. She was back in her own space, her own life. This should feel like victory. Instead, it felt like amputation. She went back to work at St. Catherine's the next day, picking up shifts like she'd never been gone. The staff welcomed her back with questions she deflected, with vague stories about family emergency out of state. She wore long sleeves to hide the designer watch Vincenzo had given her that she'd forgotten to remove. Covered her left hand so no one would see the wedding band she couldn't bring herself to take off yet. The work was familiar, comforting. She fell back into rhythm of the ER easily. Patients needing her, wounds to close, lives to save. This was who she was, who she'd always been. Not a mafia wife in designer clothes. Just Lucia Ramirez, ER nurse. But something was different. She noticed things she'd overlooked before. The gunshot victims who came through weren't just casualties anymore. They were someone's son, someone's soldier, someone's father. The violence wasn't abstract. She'd seen it up close now. Felt bullets sparking off stone while someone used his body to shield hers. She found herself wondering if any of these patients were Ferraro family. If she was treating men who answered to Vincenzo. If any of them knew who she was. Who she'd been to their boss. At night, alone in her apartment, she couldn't sleep. The bed was too small after months of king-size luxury. Too empty after sleeping pressed against solid warmth. Too quiet without the sound of someone else breathing beside her. She'd lie awake and touch the space where he should be. Hate herself for missing him. He'd killed her father. That should be unforgivable. Was unforgivable. But her traitorous body missed him anyway. The feel of his hands, the way he'd pull her close in sleep. How safe she'd felt despite everything. Her phone never rang. He didn't call, didn't text, was giving her the space she'd demanded, respecting her request for freedom in a way that felt more painful than if he'd tried to drag her back. She could almost hate him for it, for letting her go so completely. The journalism stayed buried. She couldn't bring herself to write anymore. What was the point? She'd wanted to expose corruption. Instead, she'd become part of it. Had helped streamline operations, make the empire more efficient. Her hands were as dirty as anyone's now. 3 weeks crawled by like years. Meanwhile, across the city, Vincenzo Ferraro was unraveling in his own way. With Lucia gone, the truce began fracturing immediately. Marco Salvatore saw the separation as weakness, proof that the Ferraro boss was compromised, distracted. He started testing boundaries. Small moves at first. Shipments going missing, soldiers crossing into Ferraro territory. Subtle provocations designed to gauge response. Vincenzo's response was immediate and brutal. He'd been restrained during the peace. Careful, measured. Those restraints disappeared when Lucia walked out. Men who challenged him found themselves regretting it. He conducted interrogations personally now, with a cold efficiency that made even his most loyal soldiers uncomfortable. The boss had always been dangerous, but there'd been humanity underneath. Now there was just ice and rage and mechanical violence. Dante confronted him one night, finding him in the office at 3 a.m, working through financial records with single-minded focus. Told him he was going to get himself killed. That he was operating like a man who didn't care if he lived or died. That the soldiers were worried, the family was concerned. and Marco Salvatore was going to see the vulnerability and strike. Vincenzo's response was cold. He told Dante he'd handle Marco, handle everything, that the family had nothing to worry about. Dante pushed back, said it wasn't the family he was worried about. It was Vincenzo, that Lucia had been the only thing making him human. Without her, he was just reverting to what he'd been at 16. A killing machine with a pulse. Vincenzo finally looked up from his work, admitted what they both knew, that Lucia had made him want to be better, that she'd seen something in him worth saving. And without her, he was exactly what he'd always been underneath the expensive suits and controlled demeanor. A man defined by violence. A killer who'd gotten too comfortable playing at being human. He told Dante he was fine, that he'd survived this like he'd survived everything else. But they both knew it was a lie. The attack on Lucia came on a Thursday afternoon. She was walking home from her shift, exhausted from a 12-hour day, thinking about dinner she probably wouldn't eat. The black van pulled up beside her before she could react. Professional, quick, same way she'd been taken before. But these men weren't Ferraro soldiers. They wore Salvatore colors, moved with military precision, had her in the van with a hood over her head before she could scream. The warehouse they took her to smelled like oil and mildew and blood. Old blood, soaked into concrete. The kind of place where people came to die. They removed her hood and she found herself chained to a chair in the center of a large empty space, exposed, vulnerable, terror coursing through her veins like ice. Marco Salvatore emerged from the shadows like something out of a nightmare, still wearing expensive suits, but now accessorized with a baseball bat resting casually on his shoulder. He told her she'd been very disappointing, that the marriage was supposed to secure peace. Instead, she'd run away at the first sign of difficulty. Made both families look weak, made him look weak for agreeing to the arrangement. Lucia's voice, when she found it, was steadier than she felt. Told him she wasn't property, that she'd fulfilled the bargain by marrying Vincenzo. What happened after wasn't his concern. Marco smiled. It was the smile of a shark who'd smelled blood. He told her she was exactly right. She was property. And damaged property needed to be made an example of. He circled her slowly, the bat tapping against his leg, in a rhythm that made her heart slam against her ribs. He told her Vincenzo had been getting too comfortable, too soft. The wife had been making him weak. But if something happened to that wife, well, that would remind the Ferraro boss why the old wars had been necessary. Would give him reason to retaliate. And in the chaos, Marco could make moves he'd been planning for months. She was the spark that would reignite the war. And he was going to send her back to Vincenzo one piece at a time. He raised the bat. Lucia closed her eyes, braced for the impact. The warehouse door exploded inward with a sound like thunder. Vincenzo Ferraro entered like death incarnate. He was covered in blood. Not his own, she realized. Blood from whoever he'd had to go through to find her. His face was a mask of controlled rage, eyes blazing with something that transcended simple anger. This was primal. This was a man facing the loss of everything that mattered. Salvatore soldiers moved to intercept him. They died. Quick, efficient, brutal. Vincenzo moved through them like a scythe through wheat. Gun in one hand, knife in the other. No wasted movement. Just violence distilled to its purest form. His men poured in behind him. The gunfight was short and one-sided. The Ferraros had come prepared for war. The Salvatores had expected an easy interrogation. By the time the shooting stopped, 8 Salvatore soldiers lay dead or dying. Marco tried to run. Didn't make it 3 steps before Vincenzo was on him. What followed wasn't clean or quick. Vincenzo took his time, each cut precise, each blow measured. He was methodical in his revenge, and Lucia watched, unable to look away. This was the monster everyone said he was. The killer, the devil. But he was also the man who'd come for her, who'd moved heaven and earth to find her. Marco died badly, pleading and crying. Vincenzo showed him the same mercy Marco had shown countless others. None at all. Then he was cutting her free from the chair, his hands gentle even though they were still covered in blood. Checking her for injuries with desperate thoroughness. Asking if she was hurt, if they'd touched her, his voice rough with emotion he wasn't trying to hide. She was shaking too hard to answer. Just collapsed into his arms when the restraints fell away. Let him hold her while she fell apart. He smelled like violence and death, and something essentially him. She breathed it in like oxygen. In the car, with his men driving and giving them privacy, Lucia trembled with delayed shock. Vincenzo's hands were everywhere, checking her arms, her face, satisfying himself that she was whole. His touch was frantic in a way she'd never seen from him. She whispered that he'd come for her. It shouldn't surprise her, but it did. After everything, after she'd left, after she'd called him a murderer and walked out, he'd still come. He cupped her face, made her look at him, told her he would always come for her, that even if she hated him, even if she never forgave him, even if she spent the rest of her life running from him, she was his wife, his to protect. That was a bond that didn't break no matter what. She closed her eyes against the tears, told him she didn't know how to stop loving him, that she didn't know how to forgive him, that she was trapped between grief for her father and need for him, and it was tearing her apart. His forehead pressed against hers, voice rough, told her they'd figure it out together, that they could destroy each other or save each other, but either way, they were doing it together. Because separation clearly wasn't an option. The world wouldn't let them have it. She kissed him then, desperate and needy and wrong and necessary all at once. Kissed him like he was air and gravity and the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting. He kissed her back with the same desperation, neither of them pretending anymore that they could exist apart. They were toxic and necessary and broken and bound together in ways that went beyond logic or morality. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was something darker and more real. Two damaged people who'd found each other in the worst possible way and somehow couldn't let go. The car drove them back to the estate, back to their cage that had become home, back to a bed they'd share again, because apparently neither of them knew how to survive the alternative. And if that made her weak or complicit or lost, Lucia was past caring. She'd tried freedom. It had nearly gotten her killed. At least here, in Vincenzo's arms, surrounded by violence and luxury and complicated love, she knew who she was. Even if that person wasn't anyone she'd imagined becoming. Lucia spent the first day back in the estate sleeping. Vincenzo stayed with her the entire time. Canceled meetings, delegated responsibilities. Just held her while she slept fitfully, waking from nightmares of Marco's smile and the sound of gunfire. When she finally woke properly, it was late afternoon, golden light slanting through the windows. Vincenzo beside her in the bed, laptop balanced on his knees, working but present. He set it aside the moment her eyes opened, asked how she felt. She felt broken, but said she was okay. They both knew she was lying. He told her he'd increased security, that the remaining Salvatore leadership had sued for permanent peace, that Marco's death had created a power vacuum and infighting, that no one would come for her again. She nodded, accepted the information, then told him she needed answers, real ones, not justifications or explanations designed to make her feel better. She needed to know the truth about her father. Vincenzo agreed. No more secrets. No more protection from ugly truths. If she wanted to know, he'd tell her everything. Over the next several days, Lucia used Vincenzo's resources to dig deeper into her father's life. The real life, not the sanitized memory she'd been holding on to. What she found destroyed her remaining illusions systematically. Antonio Ramirez had been embezzling from the hospitals where he worked, skimming money from procurement budgets, taking kickbacks from medical supply companies. The debts to the Salvatores hadn't been from gambling. They'd been from borrowing to cover up his theft when auditors started asking questions. He'd started informing to pay off those debts. sold information about both families, locations, personnel, schedules. The information he'd provided had gotten people killed. The ambush Dante had mentioned. 12 men dead. A wedding that ended in massacre. Her father had provided the security details that made it possible. He'd had another family, a mistress and a son in a neighboring city. Lucia had a half-brother she'd never known about. Antonio had been supporting both families with dirty money, stretched between two lives, neither of which were as wholesome as he'd pretended. The man she'd spent 3 years seeking justice for was a criminal, an embezzler, an informant, a bigamist, a man who'd gotten innocent people killed for money to maintain 2 separate lives and a gambling addiction. Lucia sat with the laptop, staring at evidence that couldn't be denied, and mourned for the father she'd never actually had. Only the image of him, the memory of a man who probably hadn't existed outside her childhood perspective. She found Vincenzo on the terrace that evening, the same place they used to have breakfast in what felt like another lifetime. He was nursing whiskey, staring at the city lights. She sat beside him without speaking for a long moment, then told him what she'd found. Everything. The full extent of her father's crimes. Vincenzo listened without interrupting, without saying, "I told you so," even though he could have. When she finished, she told him she'd spent 3 years hunting for justice for a man who didn't deserve it, that she'd made him into a monster because she needed someone to blame for losing her father, that she'd been chasing a ghost while the real man had been a criminal who got what he earned in that world. He shook his head, told her that didn't make it okay, that her father being guilty didn't absolve him of ordering the execution, that he'd still taken her father from her, that those were separate truths that could both exist. She looked at him. This man who'd kidnapped her, forced her into marriage, and killed her father, but who'd also protected her, valued her, made her feel seen and necessary, who'd risked everything to save her from Marco, who was complicated and dangerous and trying in his own broken way to be better. She told him she knew what he was, had always known, really, that he was a killer, that he'd done unforgivable things, that her father was one of hundreds who died on his orders, that this was who he was fundamentally, underneath the expensive suits and the moments of tenderness. He agreed. No defense, no mitigation, just honest acknowledgement of what he was. She asked him how she was supposed to love someone capable of such darkness, how she reconciled that with any sense of morality or self-respect. He was quiet for a long moment, then turned to face her fully, told her he'd been asking himself the same question in reverse. How did a man defined by violence deserve the love of someone who saved lives? How did he reconcile having her when he'd taken so much? He said maybe they were both broken in compatible ways, that maybe that's why they fit, that she saw his darkness and he saw her light, and somehow that balance made them both more complete, that it wasn't redemption or forgiveness, just acceptance of reality. She reached for his hand, laced their fingers together, told him she wasn't saying she forgave him, that she didn't know if she ever would completely, that there would always be a part of her that grieved her father and blamed Vincenzo for that loss. But she was saying she chose him anyway, chose them, chose this impossible, complicated, morally ambiguous thing they had, because trying to live without it had nearly destroyed them both. He raised her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles, told her that was more than he deserved but exactly what he needed. She told him she had conditions, no more secrets. Ever. She needed to know the truth of what he did, even when it was ugly, needed to be his partner, not his kept wife, needed to be in it completely or not at all. He agreed immediately, full transparency, no matter how uncomfortable. Then she told him her second condition. She wanted to help him build something legitimate, use the blood money to create something good. Hospitals, clinics, housing, programs that actually helped people instead of just exploiting them. She wanted the violence to mean something, wanted to balance the scales in whatever small way they could. He considered this longer. Told her she wanted to redeem him, save his soul. She corrected him. She wanted them to redeem each other. She'd been complicit in his operations for months now. Her hands were dirty too. This was about creating something better from the ashes of what they'd both been. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. Told her they had a deal. That he'd start transitioning more operations to legitimate businesses. That they'd build something that would outlast the violence. That maybe, in time, the family could be something other than what it had always been. She kissed him then. Not desperate or consuming, but slow and deliberate. A recommitment. A choice made with full knowledge and acceptance. They made love that night differently than before. Not frantic with need or rough with desperation. Slow and tender. Learning each other again with the weight of truth between them. He touched her like she was precious. She held him like he was hers. They moved together, building to something that felt like promise. Afterward, tangled in sheets, she traced the scar on his jaw. Asked him to tell her about the boy who'd wanted to be a doctor. The person he'd been before violence remade him. He talked for hours. About his childhood. His parents. His sister Sophia, who'd wanted to be a dancer. The books he'd read. The future he'd imagined. The moment when that future died and he'd become something else entirely. She listened and held him and saw him fully. Not the boss, not the killer, but the man. Complex and broken and trying. The man who'd been forced by circumstances into a life he'd never chosen, just like her. As dawn broke, she made her declaration. Told him she was staying, that this was her choice now, made freely, that she wanted to build this life with him, whatever that looked like. He pulled her closer, kissed her forehead, called her Mrs. Ferraro with something like wonder in his voice. She smiled against his chest, told him she preferred just Lucia, but yeah, she was his wife, his partner, his equal. And together they'd figure out how to live with what they'd both become. It wasn't redemption, it wasn't forgiveness, it was acceptance, messy and complicated and real. Two broken people choosing each other despite everything, or maybe because of it. The sun rose on their new beginning, built on truth and blood and a love that defied logic. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was theirs. 6 months passed. The kind of time that felt both endless and instant. Time enough for things to change, for plans to become reality, for the impossible to start feeling possible. The Ferraro empire was evolving. Vincenzo had been true to his word. He'd started transitioning operations, still involved in gray market activities, gambling, some weapons, information brokerage, but expanding legitimate businesses to overtake the illegal ones. They'd opened 3 free medical clinics in underserved neighborhoods. Lucia ran them personally, hired good doctors and nurses who asked no questions about funding, treated anyone who walked through the doors. Gang members with bullet wounds sat next to homeless people, with infections sat next to mothers who couldn't afford insurance. Everyone got care. Vincenzo had started a construction company that hired reformed criminals, gave them legitimate work and decent pay. A path out for soldiers who wanted to leave the life. Not many took it at first, but some did. And that was a start. They'd bought a building that had been condemned and renovated it into affordable housing. Charged rent that actually reflected what working people could pay. It wasn't charity. It was investment in the community that had made the family's fortune. It wasn't redemption. Lucia reminded herself of that constantly. You couldn't balance murder with medicine. Couldn't even the scales between violence and housing. But it was something. It was an attempt at legacy beyond just blood and fear. At home, their relationship had settled into something that felt almost normal. If normal included armed guards and business meetings about territory disputes. They worked together now, true partners. She sat in on strategy sessions. He valued her perspective. They argued about tactics and approaches, but always came back to the same place. Together. The younger soldiers started coming to Lucia with problems, medical issues they couldn't take to regular doctors, family troubles, questions about getting out. She became a confidant, someone safe in a world where trust was currency. Vincenzo noticed and approved, said she was making the family stronger by being someone people could trust. Nonna Ferraro told her one afternoon that she'd done what the old woman had hoped, made Vincenzo human again, taught him he could be both strong and gentle. That power didn't require cruelty. The old woman's approval meant more than Lucia expected. Dante remained a close friend. He'd been skeptical at first when Lucia returned, worried she'd hurt Vincenzo worse the second time she left. But watching them together, seeing how they'd built something real from disaster, had won him over. He told her once that she'd saved their boss, that Vincenzo had been heading toward either early death or complete monster. She'd pulled him back from that edge. The remaining Salvatore leadership sued for permanent peace. Marco's death had fractured their family, multiple factions fighting for control. They couldn't afford a war with the Ferraros while dealing with internal chaos. The treaty was signed with much better terms than the original marriage alliance. Lucia's kidnapping and Marco's violation of the peace had given Vincenzo leverage he'd used ruthlessly. Some days were harder than others. Lucia would have moments where she'd remember her father, the real man, not the image. She'd feel grief and anger and guilt for choosing Vincenzo despite everything. On those days, Vincenzo would give her space, let her process, be there when she needed him but not push. Other days, he'd wake from nightmares about his murdered family, about the boy he'd been, about the violence he'd committed. She'd hold him through those dreams, remind him that he was more than his worst moments, that he was trying, that trying mattered. They were healing each other, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. One evening, Lucia realized she was late. Her period that ran like clockwork was 3 days overdue. Then 5, then a week. She took a test in their bathroom, hands shaking, and stared at the positive result, with complicated emotions churning in her chest. A baby. She was pregnant with Vincenzo Ferraro's child. Part of her was terrified. Bringing a child into this world, into this life of violence and moral ambiguity. What kind of mother would she be? What kind of father would he be? But another part, a part she didn't want to examine too closely, was joyful. This was forever now, undeniable. A life they'd created together. Legacy in the most literal sense. She told him that night after dinner. Just said it plainly, that she was pregnant, that they were going to have a baby. Vincenzo went completely still, face cycling through emotions too fast to track. Then he was moving, crossing to her, falling to his knees in front of where she sat. His hands went to her stomach, flat and gentle over where their child was growing. He looked up at her with something like fear in his eyes, told her he didn't know how to be a father, that his own father had died when he was just a boy, that he'd never learned what that looked like. What if he failed? What if he passed on only darkness? She cupped his face, told him they'd figure it out together, that he'd be exactly who he was, complicated and flawed and trying, that their child would know their father was human, would see him working to be better. That would be enough. He pressed his forehead against her stomach, stayed like that for a long moment. When he looked up again, his eyes were wet. She'd never seen him cry before, didn't think he could. But there were tears on his face as he told her he'd protect them both, that he'd try to be worthy of them, that he'd start building a world their child could be proud of. She pulled him up, kissed him, told him she loved him. The words still felt complicated, still carried weight of everything between them, but they were true. Whatever love meant in their context, she felt it. He said it back, told her he loved her, that she'd saved him from becoming just another monster in a long line of them, that their child would have everything he hadn't: safety, choice, the option to walk away from this life if they wanted. They made plans that night, how to transition more operations to legitimate businesses before the baby came, how to secure their position so their child wouldn't be a target, how to be parents while being who they were. The pregnancy progressed. Lucia continued working at the clinics until her doctor insisted she slow down. Vincenzo was simultaneously overprotective and trying not to be controlling. They argued about her taking risks, compromised on reasonable precautions, learned to navigate this new dynamic. Their daughter was born on a spring morning, 8 hours of labor that Vincenzo endured beside her, letting her crush his hand and swearing in Italian. When Sofia Ferraro finally arrived, tiny and perfect and screaming, Lucia watched her dangerous husband hold their newborn daughter with shaking hands and tears streaming down his face. He named her after his murdered sister, told their newborn that he'd protect her, that she'd never know the violence he'd known, that she could be anything, do anything, choose her own path. The generational curse stopped with her. Watching him cradle their daughter, seeing him transformed by love for this tiny person, Lucia felt something shift. This was their redemption, not through good works or legitimate businesses, but through creating life and raising it with intention, through breaking cycles and building something new. 1 year later, they dedicated a new hospital wing, funded anonymously by the Ferraro family, but everyone knew. Vincenzo stood beside her at the ceremony, Sofia on his hip, playing the proud legitimate businessman. No one would guess what his empire was built on, what he'd done, who he really was underneath the smile. A reporter asked Lucia about the anonymous donor. She smiled and gave a carefully crafted answer about people who believed in second chances, in using resources to help rather than harm, in legacy that outlasted violence. That night, back home, they put Sofia to bed together. Lucia sang lullabies, while Vincenzo sat in the rocking chair, watching them with an expression she'd learned meant contentment. Their daughter fell asleep safe and loved, ignorant of the blood that had bought her perfect nursery. Later, in their bedroom, Lucia stood at the windows watching the city lights. Vincenzo wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulled her back against his chest. They stood like that, watching their empire spread below them. He asked if she ever regretted it. The choices that led them here, if she wished she could go back and choose differently. She was quiet, honest thought, told him she regretted the pain, regretted what he'd taken from her, regretted that her father was dead and that she'd never have the relationship with him she'd deserved. But regret what brought them together? She didn't know if she could. He understood, told her he regretted his actions, but couldn't regret the results, couldn't regret her, them, the family they'd built. She turned in his arms, looked up at him. This man who'd kidnapped her and married her by force and killed her father, who'd also protected her and valued her and loved her and given her a child, who was monster and man and trying to be better. She told him she'd married a monster to survive, fallen in love with a man trying to redeem himself, that she didn't know which one he was anymore, didn't know if there was even a distinction. He kissed her forehead, told her he was both, would always be both, that she'd accepted that when she chose to stay, that their love existed in the space between those truths. She smiled, sad but genuine, told him she was both too. The nurse who saved lives and the mafia wife who helped run a criminal empire, the woman seeking justice and the woman who loved her father's killer. They were both walking contradictions. He pulled her closer, told her they were perfectly imperfect together, that maybe that's all anyone could hope for. They made love that night with the city sprawling below them and their daughter sleeping safely in the next room. Moved together with the weight of everything they'd survived, built to completion that felt like affirmation. Afterward, holding each other in the darkness, Lucia thought about legacy, about what their daughter would inherit. Not just wealth or the family business, but the story of how her parents found each other, how love could grow in the darkest soil, how people could be both terrible and trying, how life was more complicated than fairy tales suggested. Sofia would grow up knowing the truth. When she was old enough, they'd tell her everything, let her decide what it meant, let her choose her own path with full knowledge of where she came from. That was the best they could offer. Honesty, options, and love fierce enough to rewrite what legacy meant. As dawn broke over the city, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Vincenzo held Lucia close and whispered that she'd made him better. Not good, but better. That their daughter would inherit that. The trying. The effort toward something more than just survival. Lucia kissed him and thought about all the ways their story wasn't a romance. About forced marriages and murders and moral compromises. About Stockholm Syndrome and trauma bonds and love that grew from violence. But it was their story, and they'd survived it. We're still surviving it. Building something from the wreckage that might, in time, become beautiful. The sun rose on another day, on Sophia waking and needing them, on clinics that would open and help people, on business both legitimate and less so that needed running, on a life neither of them had planned but both had chosen to embrace. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was an honest one. And in their world, honesty was the closest thing to happiness they'd ever get. So, do you think they're happy? Can you build a real family on a foundation of violence and forced marriage? And be honest, did you root for them in the end? Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support helps me bring you even more emotional, heartwarming stories filled with love, tension, and unforgettable moments. Stay tuned. More beautiful stories are on the way.